Chapter 12 is on the heart and cardiovascular function. So we need to know where the heart lies. It lies on the near the anterior chest wall, just behind the sternum. It is not mid-center. It's slightly to the left of midline. A couple terms here. The apex of the heart is the end that is free, and the base of the heart is the end that is attached to the body by the great blood vessels. Surrounding the heart is a pericardial sac. It is formed by the parietal pericardium. There is a pericardial cavity between the two pericardia. The visceral pericardium is right on the heart, and then outside that is the parietal pericardium, and between the two will be serous fluid. Some terminology here. We first look at the coverings of the heart, and then we look at the walls of the heart. So for the coverings of the heart, it's the pericardial sac. The outer is the parietal pericardium. The inner is the visceral pericardium. And here's that space, potential space filled with serous fluid. Now the walls of the heart are contain prefixes that you recognize at this point: endo, myo, and epi. Endo is the innermost lining of the heart. The myocardium is all this muscle, and then the epicardium is the outermost layer. And in actual fact, the epicardium is the same structure as the visceral pericardium. So the outer wall of the heart is the same structure as the inner covering of the heart. A little bit confusing. What is the innermost layer of the coverings of the heart? Visceral pericardium. Which of the descriptions of the heart is correct? It lies in the mediastinum under the sternum. Which of the following is not a layer of the wall of the heart? That would be parietal pericardium. An interesting feature of these muscles on the outside of the heart, they kind of twirl in a figure 8 here and kind of twist around the heart. Cardiac muscle tissue is different from other tissue. It is uninucleated, one nucleus per cell. They're smaller than skeletal muscles. They appear striated, but they're connected by these intercalated discs. There's specialized connections that allow the transfer of information from one cell to another. These cardiac muscle cells also may be branched. There is a region here between the lungs called the mediastinum. You can see here, this is the anterior view, and the heart always points off to the left. On an anterior view, it's attached by fibrous tissue to the diaphragm. Which of the following is not a function of the heart? That would be production of blood cells. That's a function of red bone marrow. So often they compare the heart and its membranes. They use this analogy of a fist into a partially inflated balloon. So the fist is the heart, and this is where the heart is attached to the body. It's called the base. And the balloon, the inner layer of the balloon, would be the visceral pericardium. It would be filled with serous fluid, and the outer layer of the balloon corresponds to the parietal pericardium. This pericardial cavity contains pericardial fluid, which is serous fluid, 15 to 50 mils, not a lot of fluid, but it reduces friction. And some bacterial infections, such as some bacterial infections can cause that serous fluid to dry up a bit, and it may cause inflammation of the heart. You might actually feel the heart beating if there's more friction there with less serous fluid. So here's a good view of the outer surface of the heart, pointing off to the left, so we know this is the anterior view. The right atrium, there are 4 chambers in the heart. The right atrium and the left atrium are on top. They are called the receiving chambers. The right ventricle and left ventricle are on the bottom. They're much larger. They are called the discharging ventricles because they pump the blood out. Attached to the atria are what are called auricles. They're like ear flaps that are expandable, and they just increase the size of the atrium. The heart is actually covered with quite a bit of fat, but often the fat is located in the shallow groove called the sulcus. So here is the sulcus between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Here is the sulcus between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And you'll have blood vessels traveling in those sulci. Here's an interesting remnant of fetal life. It's called the ligamentum arteriosum. It's attaching this pulmonary trunk to the aortic arch. Now, the pulmonary trunk is going to take deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and this aorta is going to take oxygenated blood to the body. Well, the fetus doesn't have any use for the lungs. So here is a connection between these two. So instead of all of the blood going to the lungs, much of it just goes right through here, right out the aorta. This is clearly not an anterior view because the heart is pointing off to the left. So you can see on the posterior view, you still have got some fat in the sulcus. You can see this huge blood vessel, one from the superior region of the body, one from the inferior region of the body, and this is draining the deoxygenated blood from the body into the right atrium. This big one here, coronary sinus, is going to take the blood that the heart uses itself to stay alive. So the heart has to use blood to keep working, and that used blood is going to go into the coronary sinus and drain into the right atrium. And that's what this is talking about. The myocardium requires constant supply of oxygen and nutrients, and so that that blood flow has to be quite rapid during exertion, and that blood flow is going to leave from the aorta. Right at the base of the aorta are 2 small openings for the coronary arteries. There's the left and right coronary artery. So here we are again, anterior view, because it's pointing to the left. Here's our right atrium. Here's the aortic arch. Here are the tiny openings for the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. So those are the only ones you have to know. There's many more. There's all these different branches, but we don't need to know them. What happens though is sometimes there's a connection between one artery and another one. So if there's a blockage in one artery, that part of the heart does not lose blood flow. It won't die. And that's called an anastomose. And if you exercise when you're young and your heart requires vast amounts of oxygen, you will grow those anastomoses and probably have a healthier heart when you're older because you've got these multiple pathways for blood to flow. Posterior view, there's the coronary sinus, all these different veins that we don't need to know. When blood flows out the aorta, there's quite a bit of pressure and it stretches the walls of the aorta. And then once the ventricle, the left ventricle relaxes, there's less pressure in that aorta and the walls of the aorta come back to normal. This is called elastic rebound. And this is going to push the blood forward into the systemic circuit, as well as pushing blood out the coronary arteries to supply the heart. There are some new terms in this chapter, many more than this, but this is a good start. A septum is a wall. So we can see here's a wall between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and that's an interventricular septum. So what do you think a wall would be called between the right atrium and the left atrium? That would be called an interatrial septum. We also have a wall here between the atrium and the ventricle, and that's often called AV, atrioventricular. Now there's an opening here called an orifice that's guarded by a valve. So this odd looking structure here is the valve. It's called a cuspid valve. A cusp is a leaf. So this is a tricuspid valve. There's 3 leaves. Here's a bicuspid valve. A bicuspid valve is also called a mitral valve. In this shot of the heart, you can see the blood coming in through the superior vena cava. There's the opening to the inferior vena cava, and there's the tiny opening of the coronary sinus that drains the heart of its blood. Those muscle projections here are called papillary muscles, and from the papillary muscles come stringy chordae tendineae that will then branch out and form these valves. Valves do what any valve does, prevent backflow. Here is a kind of a whole shot of the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So the right side of the heart is involved in the pulmonary circuit. The deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, goes to the tricuspid valve, enters the right ventricle, and then goes out a pulmonary trunk. There is a valve that guards that pulmonary trunk called a pulmonary valve. Again, the valves are preventing backflow. This blood is going to the lungs to become oxygenated. It will return to the left atrium of the heart, pass through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, out the aortic valve. It'll pass right through that aortic valve into the aorta for the systemic circuit around the body. Where are the AV valves located? AV stands for atrioventricular, so it would be D, between the atria and ventricles. So the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from 3 blood vessels, the coronary sinus, as well as the superior and inferior vena cava. There are muscles inside that wall of the atrium called pectinate muscles. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. Here's another remnant of fetal life. As deoxygenated blood enters this right atrium, this is the beginning of the pulmonary circuit. Well, the fetus does not need to use its lungs. It's not breathing. So there's an opening that directs the blood to go from the right atrium directly to the left atrium, and that's called the fossa ovalis. And that will close up when you take your first breath and become the fossa. The foramen ovale is what it's called in the fetus, and then it's the fossa ovalis once it closes up. You may have heard of a hole in the heart for a baby. That may not close up. So here's our right atrium. Blood flows through the tricuspid valve, tri before you bi. So we're following the blue deoxygenated blood to the lungs. You can see in the ventricles, these ridges, they're called trabeculae carni, that form the muscular ridges of the inside of the ventricles. There is the pulmonary valve that guards the pulmonary trunk, sending the blood to the lungs. This pulmonary trunk splits into the left and right pulmonary veins. It goes to the lungs, is going to come back through, this splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. The blood that returns is coming by way of the veins into the left atrium through the bicuspid valve, left ventricle. It passes the aortic valve and goes out the aorta. So the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the right AV valve called the tricuspid valve. When the heart contracts, the blood will go out past the pulmonary valve, out the pulmonary trunk, which will split to form the left and right pulmonary arteries. The left ventricle is thicker walled than the right ventricle because it needs more pressure to push the blood through the systemic circuit. So you can see here how this wall is much thicker on the left ventricle. Needs more push for that blood. So we'll play this short video, the heart anatomy.
The heart is a muscular pump that works continuously to circulate blood through the cardiovascular system. Blood carries oxygen, nutrients, hormones, waste, and other substances to and from cells of the body. The heart pumps our 5 liters of blood through the body nearly 1,400 times per day, every day of our lives. The human heart is divided into 4 chambers, 2 upper chambers called the atria, and 2 lower chambers, the ventricles. Near the base of the heart, blood vessels connect to each chamber. Blood enters the heart through the large veins, which empty into the thin-walled atria. Blood leaves the ventricles in large arteries, which carry blood away from the heart. You can think of the heart as 2 separate pumps operating side by side within one organ. A thin interatrial septum separates the 2 atria, and a thick interventricular septum separates the 2 ventricles. On the right side, blood enters the right atrium, then travels to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then pumps the blood through the pulmonary circuit and back into the left side of the heart. On the left side, blood enters the left atrium, then travels to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps the blood through the systemic circuit and back into the right side of the heart. When the heart beats, it propels blood simultaneously through these 2 circuits. In this design, blood flow is unidirectional. That is, it flows in one direction only, first through one circuit, then through the next, and back again to the first.